I've been hunting since I was a kid, taught by my dad and granddad. It's a family tradition, a rite of passage. But last year I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the woods. It was a horror story come to life, and it's taken me this long to even talk about it. It was late November, the tail end of hunting season. My friend Sarah and I decided to try our luck in a remote part of the Montana wilderness, a place known for its abundant game but also its isolation. We were both experienced hunters, armed with rifles and high hopes. We set up camp near a small lake surrounded by dense forest. The first day was uneventful. We saw some tracks, heard the distant calls of elk, but didn't get a shot. As night fell, we built a fire and settled in, the darkness enveloping us like a thick blanket. That's when we first heard the whispers. At first, we thought it was the wind, rustling through the trees. But then we realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like someone, or something, was whispering just beyond the edge of the campfire's light. We grabbed our rifles and flashlights, scanning the darkness. But we saw nothing, and the whispers seemed to fade away as mysteriously as they had come. Uneasy but not willing to pack it in, we eventually went to sleep, attributing the strange sounds to our overactive imaginations. The next morning, we set out early, determined to bag some game. We hiked deeper into the forest, the whispers from the night before almost forgotten. Almost. Around midday, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, and within the circle were markings on the ground. Symbols that neither of us recognized, but that filled us with an inexplicable sense of dread. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tinged with unease. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, we heard it again. That whispering, now louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. We raised our rifles, our eyes darting in every direction. And that's when we saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies unnaturally thin and elongated. "We need to go now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We turned and ran, our boots pounding on the forest floor, the whispering growing louder and more frenzied with each step. We didn't stop until we reached our camp, out of breath and shaken to our core. We reached our camp, panting and terrified, but what we found there made our blood run cold. Our tents were slashed open, our supplies scattered, and the fire was out. It was as if the camp had been ravaged by some wild animal or worse. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, my mind racing. We packed up what we could, shouldered our rifles, and started making our way back to the truck, which was parked a couple of miles away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was almost worse. About halfway to the truck, Sarah froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears, and then I heard it. A soft, melodic humming, coming from somewhere off to our right. It was a tune that was somehow both familiar and completely alien, and it filled me with a sense of impending doom. Without a word, we quickened our pace, but the humming followed us, growing louder and more discordant with each step. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We reached the truck and threw our gear in the back, not even bothering to properly stow it. I turned the key in the ignition and let out a sigh of relief as the engine roared to life. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, those shadowy figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us, and I could have sworn I saw their lips moving, as if whispering a dark incantation. We didn't stop driving until we reached civilization, and even then, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We reported our experience to the local authorities, but they seemed skeptical, attributing our story to the overactive imaginations of two city folks out of their element. But we know what we saw and what we heard, and neither of us has gone back into the woods since. Some things are better left undiscovered, some whispers better left unheard. And so, every hunting season, as others venture into the wilderness in search of game, I stay home, haunted by the memory of that horrifying trip and the whispering woods that I know are still out there, waiting.
My name's Emily, and I'm no stranger to hunting. My dad took me on my first hunting trip when I was just 12, and I've been hooked ever since. But last year I had an experience that made me question not just hunting, but my own sanity. I decided to go on a solo hunting trip in a remote part of Oregon. I'd heard stories about the area, rumors of strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances, but I dismissed them as just that, stories. How wrong I was. I set up camp near a picturesque stream, feeling a sense of peace and solitude that only the great outdoors can provide. The first day was uneventful, filled with the usual tracking and scouting, but no game. As night fell, I cooked some canned beans over the fire and settled into my tent, the sounds of the forest lulling me to sleep. But then, I heard it, a faint, distant sound that seemed out of place. It was like the tinkling of bells, soft but clear, cutting through the stillness of the night. Intrigued, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, along a narrow, overgrown trail. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The tinkling grew louder as I walked, guiding me like a siren's call. After about 20 minutes, I reached a clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It was a circle of mushrooms, unnaturally large and glowing faintly in the darkness. And in the center of the circle was a figure, its back to me, dressed in what looked like ancient, tattered robes. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to obey. The figure slowly turned to face me, and I'll never forget what I saw. It had the face of a deer, but its eyes were human, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that made my skin crawl. The creature spoke, its voice a guttural mix of animal and human tones. "You shouldn't be here." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. But before I could even think of a response, the creature let out a high-pitched whistle. From the darkness of the forest, more figures emerged, each one more grotesque than the last. Humanoid shapes with animal features, twisted and wrong. "You've trespassed into our domain," the deer-faced creature said, its eyes narrowing. I raised my rifle, my hands trembling, but the creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Your weapons won't help you here," it said, and with a wave of its hand, my rifle flew out of my grasp, landing several feet away. I felt a sense of utter despair wash over me. I was unarmed, outnumbered, and in a place that defied all logic and reason. But just when I thought it was the end, the creature spoke again. "We'll let you go, but you must pay the price," it said, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Before I could ask what it meant, one of the other creatures lunged at me, sinking its teeth into my arm. I screamed in pain as I felt something being drawn out of me. Not blood, but something far more vital. When it finally released me, I collapsed to the ground, weakened and disoriented. The deer-faced creature approached me, its eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. "You may leave now, but know this, you're forever bound to this place. You'll be drawn back again and again until you've paid your debt in full." With that, the creatures retreated into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled back to my camp, my body aching, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I packed up and left as soon as I could, vowing never to return. But true to the creature's words, I felt a pull, a compulsion to go back. I resisted it for as long as I could, but eventually I found myself standing at the edge of that cursed clearing once again, and I knew deep down that I would continue to return, each time paying a little more of the terrible price for my trespass.
I've always loved the fall archery season, the crisp air, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the thrill of the hunt. It's a time when nature's beauty is at its peak, and the world seems to slow down just a bit. But last year, my annual hunting trip turned into something out of a horror story, something so bone-chilling that even now, I hesitate to recount it. It was a typical October morning when my buddy Mark and I headed out to our favorite hunting spot deep in the Appalachian woods. We'd been coming here for years, and it felt like a second home. We were armed with our compound bows, dressed in camo, and ready for a day of stalking deer. The first few hours were uneventful. We saw a couple of does, but decided to hold out for a buck. Around noon, we split up to cover more ground. Mark went east, and I headed west, agreeing to meet back at our base camp by sunset. As I moved through the forest, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, or maybe the adrenaline kicking in, but the feeling persisted. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the wind, or small critters going about their business. I finally spotted a buck around 3 p.m. My heart raced as I took aim, but just as I was about to release the arrow, a deafening screech echoed through the woods. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, part animal, part something else. The buck bolted, and I was left standing there, bow in hand, utterly bewildered. I tried to shake off the unease and decided to head back to camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced and flickered between the trees. That's when I heard it, a low growl coming from behind me. I turned around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Probably just a coyote, I muttered to myself, quickening my pace. But then I heard it again, this time closer and more menacing. I broke into a jog, my eyes darting in every direction. That's when I tripped over a tree root and went sprawling onto the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard the growl once more, now just a few yards away. I nocked an arrow and drew my bow, my hands trembling. I waited, my eyes straining in the dim light. And then I saw it, or rather, I saw its eyes, two glowing orbs hovering in the darkness. I released the arrow, hearing it whiz through the air before hitting something solid with a thud. The eyes disappeared, and for a moment, I thought I'd hit whatever it was. But then the eyes reappeared, this time higher off the ground, as if the creature had grown taller. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't natural. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs pumping as if my life depended on it. Because it did. I finally burst into the clearing where our base camp was set up, expecting to see Mark waiting for me. But the camp was empty, and what's worse, it looked like it had been ransacked. The tent was torn, our supplies scattered, and Mark's bow lay broken on the ground. "Mark!" I yelled, my voice tinged with panic. "Mark, where are you?" And then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard that same terrifying screech, followed by a sound that froze me to my core, a human scream. After hearing that human scream, my heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I grabbed another arrow, nocked it, and aimed it toward the direction of the scream. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the bow steady. "Mark! Answer me, man!" I yelled again, my voice cracking. No response, just an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and my own ragged breathing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something was emerging from the woods, dragging itself into the clearing. My eyes widened as I realized the figure emerging from the woods was Mark, but he was in bad shape. His clothes looked like they'd been through a shredder. I dropped my bow and ran to him, falling to my knees as I reached his battered body. His eyes flickered open, meeting mine for just a moment before he whispered, "Run. It's still here." And then he was gone. I felt a hot tear roll down my cheek, but there was no time to mourn. I heard that low growl again, closer now, almost like a chuckle. I picked up my bow, my resolve hardening. This thing had taken my friend, and I wasn't about to let it take me too. I heard a rustling behind me and spun around just in time to see a dark shape lunging at me from the shadows. I released the arrow, hitting it square in the chest. It let out an ear-piercing screech and staggered back, but it didn't go down. Instead, it lunged at me again, faster this time. I barely had time to dodge as its claws swiped the air where I had been standing a split second before. I rolled to the ground, grabbing another arrow and scrambling to my feet. But before I could knock it, the creature was on me, knocking the bow out of my hands and pinning me to the ground. I could feel its hot, fetid breath on my face as it leaned in, its eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence that made my skin crawl. I knew I was about to die, to be torn apart like Mark, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, something miraculous happened. A deafening gunshot rang out, and the creature howled in pain, its grip loosening just enough for me to wriggle free. I looked up to see another hunter emerge from the woods, rifle in hand. "Get down!" he yelled, firing another shot. This time, the creature let out a wail that sounded almost human and retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The hunter helped me to my feet, his face grim. "You're lucky I came along when I did," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I've been tracking that thing for years. Never seen it come this close to a camp before." I looked back at Mark's lifeless body, my heart heavy with grief and guilt. "Not lucky enough," I whispered. As we made our way out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. And as we drove away, I looked back one last time to see those glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. I haven't been back to the woods since that day, and I doubt I ever will. Some things are better left undisturbed, some hunts better left unfinished. But every fall, when the leaves start to change and the air turns crisp, I can't help but remember that horrifying night and the unseen predator that still lurks in those woods.